It's strange how disaster often hides in plain sight. Not in a storm, not in a failure of engines, but in the tiniest human mistake. One wrong assumption, one unnoticed detail, and suddenly, everything is hanging by a thread. That's the unsettling part about flying. The system is built to be airtight, yet it's still flown, managed, and trusted to people. And people, no matter how skilled, can be tired, distracted, or convinced they're seeing something that isn't really there. One quiet night in San Francisco, that thin line between safety and tragedy almost broke. And had it gone differently, we wouldn't be talking about a close call. We'd be talking about the deadliest crash in history. This is the story of Air Canada Flight 759. Air Canada Flight 759 had lifted off from Toronto Pearson International Airport just before 10 p.m. local time. The Airbus A320, tail number CFKCK, was a workhorse of the fleet. Already 25 years in service, but carefully maintained, flying thousands of hours each year without incident. On board that night were 135 passengers and 5 crew, most of them settling into the rhythm of a red-eye crossing. To them, it was a quiet, transcontinental hop, nothing unusual. At the controls sat a seasoned pair. The captain, 56 years old, carried more than 20,000 flight hours, including nearly 5,000 on the A32. He had flown into San Francisco many times before. His first officer, 42, had logged more than 10,000 hours, 2,400 of them in the same aircraft type. This was not an inexperienced crew. These were professionals with decades of combined flying behind them. Yet experience can be a double-edged sword. Familiarity breeds confidence, and sometimes confidence carries blind spots. For the crew of AC 759, the assignment seemed ordinary. Toronto to San Francisco, 5 hours gate to gate. A landing on runway 28 right, one of the airport's main arrivals. A standard checklist, a stable approach, a routine close to a long day. But the flight left Toronto late. A half-hour delay put them on approach well past their body clock's natural rhythm. For the captain, who had been awake nearly 19 hours, it was the dead of night in his home time zone. His mind and body were operating under fatigue, even if he didn't acknowledge it. Fatigue has no warning light. Still, nothing about the descent raised suspicion. Weather was clear. Visibility stretched for miles. The controller's instructions were routine. On the radar screen, AC 759 looked perfectly lined up. What the instruments showed, and what the pilots believed, were about to diverge. From 30,000 feet down to 3,000, it looked like another red-eye, another safe landing. But as San Francisco came into view, the airport that greeted them was not the airport they remembered. And that difference would open the door to catastrophe. San Francisco International is no ordinary airport. Its runways are set side by side in tightly spaced pairs with the main arrival runways, 28 left and 28 right, separated by just 750 feet. For pilots, the layout demands precision, especially at night. On July 7th, one of those runways was missing. Runway 28 left had been shut down for maintenance at 10 p.m., leaving it dark and lifeless. A flashing white X marked its threshold, signaling closure. With its lights extinguished, what remained was a black strip of asphalt, nearly invisible against the surrounding tarmac. Beside it, however, Taxiway C was alive with light. Its edge and center line glowed against the darkness. And to a crew descending after hours in the cockpit, expecting to see 2 parallel runways side by side, the combination created a dangerous illusion. Expectation bias, the mind's tendency to see what it anticipates, was already in play. The captain and first officer, having landed at SFO before, were conditioned to spot 2 glowing runways. When their eyes met the sight of one lit strip and another bright surface nearby, the brain filled in the blanks. 28 left, 28 right, runway and runway. But that wasn't reality. The lit surface was no runway at all. It was Taxiway C, and on it, 4 aircraft sat waiting. United One, a Boeing 787-9 with more than 250 people aboard. Philippine Airlines 115, an Airbus A340 with 264, another United 787, and a 737 at the tail of the queue. Together, over 1,000 passengers and crew sat just beneath the path AC 759 was aligning with. Minutes earlier, another arriving crew had told investigators that Taxiway C's lights gave the impression it could have been a runway. They weren't wrong. The trap was already set, hidden in plain sight, and now Flight 759 was falling into it. The human body runs on rhythm. Pilots know it well, the circadian clock that governs alertness and performance. By the time Air Canada 759 reached San Francisco, it was nearly 3 a.m. Toronto time. The captain had been awake for 19 straight hours, his first officer 12. By U.S. regulations, the captain wouldn't have been permitted to fly at all in that state, but under Canadian rules, he was still legal. Fatigue does not announce itself, but it quietly dulls reaction time, narrows focus, and blurs judgment. On that approach, fatigue paired with another silent adversary, expectation bias. The crew was accustomed to seeing two parallel runways on final. When only one was visible, the mind improvised, reshaping the taxiway lights into a runway that wasn't there. It wasn't carelessness. It was the brain doing what brains do, forcing new data to fit an old pattern. Safeguards should have helped. The notice to airmen, NOTAM, warned that runway 28 left was closed, but NOTAMs have long been criticized as unreadable, crammed with technical shorthand that can stretch for dozens of pages. In the torrent of details, a crucial fact drowned. The captain glanced at the notice earlier in the day but dismissed it, believing it irrelevant to their expected arrival time. The first officer couldn't even recall seeing it. There was another layer missing. The instrument landing system, the ILS for runway 28R, could have electronically guided them to the correct center line, but the crew never tuned it. Visual approaches were allowed, and in good weather, they often seemed easier. That decision stripped away the last objective reference. Piece by piece, the defenses fell. Fatigue dulled perception. Expectation bias distorted it. NOTAMs buried critical warnings. The ILS sat silent, small misses stacking into one. And as the aircraft sank lower through the night, each link in that chain pulled them closer to disaster. The descent looked stable. Air Canada 759 was cleared for runway 28 right at 11:46 p.m. By 11:55, the Airbus was dropping below 300 feet. Then came the first crack in the picture. Just want to confirm, Air Canada 759, we see some lights on the runway there, across the runway. Can you confirm we're cleared to land? The captain radioed. The controller, juggling both tower and ground frequencies alone, responded 10 seconds later. Air Canada 759, confirmed cleared to land on 28 right. There is no one on 28 right but you. Reassured, the crew pressed on, but outside the cockpit window, what they thought was runway 28R was actually Taxiway C, lined with 4 aircraft waiting their turn. On the ground, pilots in those jets began to see the danger. Crew of United Flight 1 at the front of the queue broke in. Where is this guy going? He's on the taxiway. Seconds later, Philippine Airlines 115 snapped on their landing lights, a desperate visual warning. Inside AC 759, the cockpit grew tense. The first officer felt something was off. The captain hesitated, then pushed the throttles forward. Flight data later showed that the moment came at just 89 feet above the ground. 2.5 seconds later, the Airbus skimmed to its lowest point, 59 feet. 14 feet separated the A320's belly from the tail of United's 787. That margin is less than the height of a 2-story building. Then, finally, the climb began. The Airbus clawed back into the night sky, engines surging. In the tower, the controller's order to go around came 5 seconds too late. The worst was narrowly avoided, but the full weight of how close they had come was only beginning to sink in. For a moment that had come within seconds of rewriting aviation history, the aftermath was strangely muted. AC 759 climbed, circled, and landed without further incident. The passengers disembarked unaware of how close they had come. To them, it was a slightly bumpy ending to a long red-eye, and then the aircraft flew on. 3 more flights over the next 2 days. By the time the National Transportation Safety Board was notified, the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, had already overwritten itself. Modern CVRs retain only 2 hours of audio before looping. The most critical piece of evidence, the voices inside the cockpit in those decisive moments, was lost forever. Investigators pressed on with what they had: radar data, flight recorder telemetry, pilot interviews. The picture that emerged was unsettling. Fatigue had dulled the captain's edge. Expectation bias had distorted both pilots' perception. NOTAMs had buried a crucial detail in indecipherable clutter. The instrument landing system, left untuned, had denied them a final safeguard. And at the tower, a single controller was juggling both ground and air frequencies, unable to detect the misalignment until alerted by other crews. Yet in each case, the conclusion was the same. Nothing illegal had occurred. The crew had followed rules. The controller had met staffing minimums. minimums. The NOTAM had been issued, even if unreadable. The CVR had been overwritten, just as regulations allowed. That was the most disturbing finding of all. A sequence that had nearly produced the worst crash in aviation history had unfolded entirely within the boundaries of what the system permitted, which raised the question, if everything was legal, how safe was the system really? The near miss of Air Canada Flight 759 did not end in tragedy, but it forced aviation authorities to confront a troubling truth. The safeguards in place had not been enough. Something had to change. At San Francisco, the FAA moved quickly. New rules prohibited visual-only approaches at night when a parallel runway was closed. Pilots would now be required to use precision guidance, either the instrument landing system or satellite-based approaches, removing the possibility of misidentifying a taxiway for a runway. Staffing, too, was addressed. No longer would a single controller be left to juggle tower and ground duties during late-night arrival peaks. The FAA mandated at least 2 controllers at SFO during those critical windows, ensuring an extra set of eyes and ears in the tower. The investigation also highlighted a glaring weakness in cockpit voice recorders. With AC-759's audio erased by routine operations, investigators had lost the most valuable record: the pilot's real-time thought process. The NTSB pressed for change, and international regulators soon moved toward extending CVR capacity to 25 hours. Longer memory meant more accountability and fewer chances for vital evidence to vanish. Air Canada made its own adjustments. The airline revised approach charts into San Francisco, making it unmistakably clear that Taxiway C ran parallel to Runway 28R. Simulator training was updated to include scenarios at SFO, teaching crews how expectation bias could mislead them. Fatigue awareness and crew resource management were emphasized with new rigor. In Canada, the issue of pilot fatigue could no longer be ignored. Transport Canada introduced new duty rules for reserve pilots, intended to bring standards closer to international norms. The reforms faced criticism for not going far enough, but they marked a step forward. These were not just minor tweaks. They were systemic corrections born from a narrow escape. The lesson was stark. Aviation safety is not static. It evolves, often only after the system brushes the edge of disaster. And San Francisco was not alone. Around the world, similar cracks were appearing. It was a frigid evening at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport, January 13, 2023. An American Airlines Boeing 777 taxied out for departure. At the same time, a Delta Airlines Boeing 737 accelerated down runway 4L, engines roaring into takeoff. Then came the mistake. The American crew cleared to cross runway 31L instead began to cross runway 4L, the very runway the Delta jet was already thundering down. On the tower frequency, an air traffic controller caught it instantly. The voice cut sharp. Delta 1943, cancel takeoff clearance. Abort! The Delta crew reacted within seconds, hauling back the throttles. Brakes screamed as the jet decelerated. By the time they stopped, only 1,000 feet of concrete separated them from the American 777 now moving across their path. 1,000 feet in aviation terms is nothing more than a blink. The NTSB later determined that standard callouts could have averted the error. If the American crew had verbalized aloud, crossing runway 31L, their shared crosscheck might have caught the slip. But in the rhythm of a busy taxi, it hadn't happened. Once again, the lesson was painfully clear. Small deviations cascade into massive risks. A misread instruction, a lapse in verbal verification, a near collision between 2 wide-body jets, each carrying hundreds of lives. The pattern was familiar. Tiny human missteps were exposing enormous vulnerabilities. And just weeks later, it would happen again, this time in Texas. The morning of February 4th, 2023, brought dense fog to Austin Bergstrom International Airport. Visibility was minimal, the runway edges fading into gray. A FedEx Boeing 767 cargo jet was cleared to land. At the same moment, a Southwest Airlines 737 was cleared for takeoff on the same strip of asphalt. In the soup of fog, neither crew could see the other. The system, too, was blind. Austin lacked the kind of advanced ground radar that might have flagged the conflict. As the FedEx descended, the outline of the Southwest jet finally appeared. The FedEx pilots reacted instantly. Throttles pushed forward, nose pitched up. The heavy freighter roared over the 737 by barely 150 to 200 feet, less than the length of a football field. On the ground, the Southwest jet continued its roll, unaware until later just how close they had come. The NTSB board member reviewing the incident spoke bluntly. The system failed. The safeguards that should have prevented 2 aircraft from sharing the same runway in zero visibility had not been there. Technology gaps often remain invisible until the moment they matter most. That morning, the absence of ground radar nearly cost hundreds of lives. The chain of near misses was growing. From San Francisco to New York to Austin, each event revealed the same truth. Safety margins were thinner than they appeared. And still, February had one more close call to come. Just weeks after Austin, another airport joined the list. February 22nd, 2023, Hollywood Burbank Airport, a compact airfield hemmed in by neighborhoods, mountains, and freeways. Space is tight. Workload is high. On that night, a SkyWest Airlines Embraer 175 was instructed to line up and wait on runway 33. That phrase meant hold position, prepare for takeoff, but do not roll. At the same time, a Mesa Airlines CRJ 900 was cleared to land on the very same runway. In the tower, the local controller's focus was split. A third aircraft had entered the frequency, adding distraction. The clearance to SkyWest never advanced to takeoff. Yet moments later, the Mesa jet descended toward a runway already occupied. The Mesa crew saw it. They judged separation insufficient, and they made their choice: go around. Engines surged, nose pitched up, wings banking back into the night sky. From the tower's perspective, the situation had been seconds away from a collision. The SkyWest jet sat on the asphalt where the Mesa was about to touch down. The investigation traced it back to workflow. Controllers are trained to compartmentalize, but they are still human. One stray task, one competing call can divert attention. When focus fractures, timing slips, and in aviation, timing is everything. The Mesa pilots had averted disaster with quick action, but their decision also underscored the fragility of safety margins. Controllers operate at the edge of human concentration, and when that edge frays, risk seeps in. The string of incidents was no longer isolated flukes. They were symptoms. And in Boston, just 5 days later, the pattern continued. February 27, 2023, Boston Logan International Airport. A JetBlue Embraer 190 approached runway 9, cleared to land. Ahead of them, a private Learjet 60 had been told to line up and wait. What happened next defied logic. Instead of holding, the Learjet began its takeoff roll. The pilots had not been cleared, yet they advanced the throttles, accelerating directly into conflict with the inbound JetBlue. The surface detection radar lit up the mistake. The controller, seeing the collision path, snapped out an order: JetBlue 206, go around, go around. The Embraer obeyed instantly. As it climbed, it passed just 30 feet above the rising Learjet, a near miss so thin that investigators later called it startling. When questioned, the Learjet captain admitted he believed he'd been cleared. He had read back the line up and wait instruction correctly, but in his mind, it had transformed into clearance for takeoff. Fatigue, workload, and expectation had blended into a false memory. That kind of error is especially dangerous because it feels real. To the pilot, there was no doubt. He had heard clearance that never came. And unlike mechanical faults, false memory leaves no trail until the consequences unfold. For Boston, catastrophe had been avoided by seconds and feet, but the vulnerability it exposed was deeper. Even professional crews in busy, high-stakes environments can mishear their own minds. The lesson was unnerving. If safety depends on perfect memory under pressure, then safety is never absolute. And just weeks later in Washington, that fragility was put on display again. Spring of 2024 brought two more close calls, both at Washington's Reagan National Airport, an airfield already notorious for its compact layout and dense traffic. The first came on April 18th. A Southwest 737 was cleared to cross a runway. At the same moment, a JetBlue Embraer 190 was beginning its takeoff roll. The aircraft came within 300 feet before controllers halted both. A near disaster, frozen in place. Barely a month later, May 29th, it happened again. An American Airlines jet was cleared for takeoff. At the same time, a private King Air was cleared to land on an intersecting runway. The American crew had no choice but to abort their roll. 2 incidents in weeks at the same airport rattled confidence. FAA officials began weighing an extraordinary option, shutting one of Reagan's runways entirely to reduce the risk. For a capital city airport, that kind of measure underscored the severity of the problem. Each case looked different on the surface. Miscommunication in one, conflicting clearances in another. But together they echoed the same refrain. The system, stretched to capacity, left less and less room for error. And when errors did happen, the difference between safety and catastrophe came down to second or feet. Air Canada 759 had not been an anomaly. It was the loudest warning in a chorus that stretched across the continent. A reminder that aviation's safety net, for all its technology and procedures, is still held together by human choices in the most fragile of moments. And yet, because of that night in San Francisco, the system is stronger. Rules changed, training evolved, fatigue limits tightened. The industry learned not through tragedy, but through survival. 59 feet separated silence from catastrophe, and in that margin, aviation found a reason to do better. That's why the story of the worst crash that never happened matters. It reminds us that progress is written not only in wreckage, but in the narrow escapes that force us to look harder. If you'd like to keep uncovering the hidden stories that shape how we fly today, subscribe. These lessons aren't just history, they're what keep us alive today. Thanks for watching.